Hi, this is Mahavan Das. Welcome to Simple Gita, Chapter 13. This chapter is entitled Nature, the Enjoyer, and Consciousness. Let's take a look at the connection between it and the previous chapter. The middle 6 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita directly explain and glorify the top rung on the yoga ladder, Bhakti Yoga. In chapter 13, Krishna begins to explain how jnana, or metaphysical knowledge, can lead to bhakti. These final 6 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita are somewhat more technical than the first 12 chapters, but we'll try to make them as simple as possible. Here's our overview of chapter 13. In this chapter, Krishna gives detailed metaphysical knowledge of the body, the soul, the supersoul, material nature, and the process of acquiring spiritual knowledge. Let's check out the first verse and purport here in the 13th chapter. This is actually the first 2 verses. Arjuna said, "O my dear Krishna, I wish to know about Prakriti, nature, Purusha, the enjoyer, the field and the knower of the field, and of knowledge and the object of knowledge." The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "This body, O son of Kunti, is called the field, and one who knows this body is called the knower of the field." Srila Prabhupada's purport. Arjuna was inquisitive about Prakriti, nature, Purusha, the enjoyer, Chaitra, the field, Chaitragya, its knower, and knowledge and the object of knowledge. When he inquired about all these, Krishna said that this body is called the field, and that one who knows this body is called the knower of the field. This body is the field of activity for the conditioned soul. The conditioned soul is entrapped in material existence, and he attempts to lord it over material nature. And so, according to his capacity to dominate material nature, he gets a field of activity. This field of activity is the body. And what is the body? The body is made of senses. The conditioned soul wants to enjoy sense gratification. And according to his capacity to enjoy sense gratification, he is offered a body or field of activity. Therefore, the body is called Chaitra, or the field of activity for the conditioned soul. Now, the person who should not identify himself with the body is called Chaitragya, the knower of the field. It is not very difficult to understand the difference between the field and its knower, the body and the knower of the body. Any person can consider that from childhood to old age, he undergoes so many changes of body, and yet is still one person remaining. Thus, there is a difference between the knower of the field of activities and the actual field of activities. A living conditioned soul can thus understand that he is different from the body. It is described in the beginning, Dehinusmin, that the living entity is within the body, and that the body is changing from childhood to boyhood, and from boyhood to youth, and from youth to old age. And the person who owns the body knows that the body is changing. The owner is distinctly Chaitragya. Sometimes we think, I am happy, I am a man, I am a woman, I am a dog, I am a cat. These are the bodily designations of the knower. But the knower is different from the body. Although we may use many articles, our clothes, etc., we know that we are different from the things used. Similarly, we also understand by a little contemplation that we are different from the body. I or you or anyone else who owns the body is called Chaitragya, the knower of the field of activities, and the body is called Chaitra, the field of activities itself. In the first 6 chapters of Bhagavad Gita, the knower of the body, the living entity, and the position by which he can understand the Supreme Lord are described. In the middle 6 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and the relationship between the individual soul and the Supersoul in regard to devotional service are described. The superior position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the subordinate position of the individual soul are definitely defined in these chapters. The living entities are subordinate under all circumstances, but in their forgetfulness they are suffering. When enlightened by pious activities, they approach the Supreme Lord in different capacities, as the distressed, those in want of money, the inquisitive, and those in search of knowledge. So these were the 4 types of pious people who Krishna explained in the 7th chapter approach him. That is also described, now starting with the 13th chapter, how the living entity comes into contact with material nature and how he is delivered by the Supreme Lord through the different methods of fruitive activities, cultivation of knowledge, and the discharge of devotional service are explained. Although the living entity is completely different from the material body, he somehow becomes related. This is also explained. Let's go over the key points for the chapter. The first key point is, as we heard in the first text, Arjuna's 6 questions. He wants to know about Prakriti or nature, Purusha, the enjoyer, the field and the knower of the field, and of knowledge and the object of knowledge. So the next key point we get is Krishna's answers to some of Arjuna's questions. He describes Chaitra, or the field of activities, Chaitragya, or the knower of the field of activities, and Jnanam, or knowledge. As he explained in text 2, this body, O son of Kunti, is called the field, and one who knows this body is called the knower of the field. So Chaitra, the field of activities for the soul, is the body. That's the instrument that we use in this world to interact with it. And one who knows it is the soul, or the Chaitragya, the knower of the field of activities. So we are conscious, or we know, about our own body. Now Krishna also explains that the Chaitragya, or the knower of the field of activities, is not just the individual soul, it's also himself as the Supersoul, because the Supersoul also knows the body. But there is a difference between the soul and the Supersoul, in that the individual soul is only conscious of his own body, whereas the Supersoul is conscious of all bodies. The Supersoul is present in all bodies without distinction. Srila Prabhupada makes a point here in his purport that by a little contemplation we can understand that we are different from our body. And he compares the body to an article that we use, like clothing, for example. This analogy was given in the 2nd chapter, that the body is like a dress or an item of clothing that we wear, and we are like the person within that clothing. So he explains here that the body is changing, but the observer of the body isn't changing. We're the same person throughout all the bodily and mental changes that we experience. So just as in the ordinary sense, our clothing is wearing out and we're changing our clothing, but we remain the same person. Similarly, from lifetime to lifetime, and actually even within this life, our own body is changing, and at the same time we are the observer of those changes who is not changing. So just by a little contemplation, we can easily understand that we are different from our body. Of course, our mind is also a type of body. It's a subtle body, and that is also changing. The mind is always changing. It's thinking, it's feeling, it's willing. But at the same time, we're observing those changes, and we are not actually changing. Specifically, our core identity doesn't change, regardless of all the changes of body and mind. Srila Prabhupada also explains here that although we are completely different from the body, somehow or other we become related with it. So how does that take place? That's explained in this chapter. And how we can be free from this incompatible situation is also described here. Krishna goes on to explain jnanam, or knowledge, as being knowledge of the relationship between the soul, the supersoul, and the body. That's actual knowledge. And so after explaining the terms field of activities, knower of the field, and knowledge, Krishna then goes on to describe the field of activities, or the body, in more detail. Krishna explains here that the body consists of the 5 great elements. That's earth, water, fire, air, and ether. These were explained in the 7th chapter. False ego, intelligence, the unmanifested, the 10 senses. So we have a total of 10 senses, the senses for working, and then the senses for acquiring knowledge, 5 of each, and the mind, which is a subtle sense or the sense within, the 5 sense objects. So those are the objects with which our senses interact: forms, tastes, smells, touches, and sounds. And then there's desire, hatred, happiness, distress, the aggregate, the life symptoms, and convictions. He says all these are considered in summary to be the field of activities and its interactions. So this is the body and its interactions described here in summary. Now the next key point we get in the chapter is the process of acquiring knowledge. So Krishna next explains 20 elements that assist in the acquisition of spiritual knowledge, meaning knowledge of the soul, the supersoul, and the body. He says humility, pridelessness, non-violence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a bona fide spiritual master, cleanliness, steadiness, self-control, renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, absence of false ego, the perception of the evil of birth, death, old age, and disease, detachment, freedom from entanglement with children, wife, home, and the rest, even-mindedness amidst pleasant and unpleasant events, constant and unalloyed devotion to me, aspiring to live in a solitary place, detachment from the general mass of people, accepting the importance of self-realization, and philosophical search for the absolute truth. So he says these items constitute the process of acquiring spiritual knowledge. Now the essential element here is bhakti. Srila Prabhupada explains that here in his purport. He says, if one accepts this process, then the possibility of approaching the absolute truth exists. The embodied soul is entrapped by the body, which is a casing made of 24 elements. So that's an interesting way to understand your body, a casing made of these 24 elements that Krishna explained earlier. And the process of knowledge, as described here, is a means to get out of it. Of all the descriptions of the process of knowledge, the most important point is described in the first line of the 11th verse. Mai chananya yogena bhaktir avyabhacharane. The process of knowledge terminates in unalloyed devotional service to the Lord. So if one does not approach or is not able to approach the transcendental service of the Lord, then the other 19 items are of no particular value. But if one takes to devotional service, in full Krishna consciousness, the other 19 items automatically develop within him. So the beginning of this process is humility. That is the first item on the list. And actually, humility is the beginning of any type of learning. Without that, we don't get anywhere in any field of education. Srila Prabhupada stresses the importance of humility at the end of his purport. He says, if anyone wants to compete with God and at the same time make advancement in spiritual knowledge, he will be frustrated. It is clearly stated that without humility, understanding is not truly possible. To think oneself God is most puffed up. Although the living entity is always being kicked by the stringent laws of material nature, he still thinks, I am God because of ignorance. The beginning of knowledge, therefore, is amanitva, humility. One should be humble and know that he is subordinate to the Supreme Lord. Due to rebellion against the Supreme Lord, one becomes subordinate to material nature. One must know and be convinced of this truth. Srila Prabhupada also explains that genuine humility has a specific way of manifesting. And he says here, the principle of accepting a spiritual master, as mentioned in the 8th verse, is essential. Even for one who takes to devotional service, it is most important. Transcendental life begins when one accepts a bona fide spiritual master. So this is how humility manifests, by accepting a qualified teacher, accepting that I don't know everything and I can learn something from this legitimate authority in spiritual science. The next key point we get in the chapter is the object of knowledge. So what is the object of knowledge? Krishna explains there are two objects of knowledge, the individual soul and the supersoul. These are what is to be known through the process of knowledge. So Krishna explains them. He only gives a brief description of the individual soul because the individual soul has been described extensively in previous chapters. He says, Brahman, the spirit, beginningless and subordinate to me, lies beyond the cause and effect of this material world. So the individual soul is beyond all material changes because the soul is eternal. It has no beginning or end. And of the supersoul, he gives more details in this section. He says, everywhere are his hands and legs, his eyes, heads and faces, and he has ears everywhere. In this way, the supersoul exists, pervading everything. He is the original source of all senses, yet he is without senses. That means he's without material senses. He is unattached, although he is the maintainer of all living beings. He transcends the modes of material nature, and at the same time, he is the master of the modes of material nature. We'll hear more about those modes in chapter 14, the next chapter. He exists outside and inside of all living beings, the moving and the non-moving. Because he is subtle, he is beyond the power of the material senses to see or to know. Although far, far away, he is also near to all. Although he appears to be divided among all beings, he is never divided. He is situated as one. Although he is the maintainer of every living entity, it is to be understood that he devours and develops all. He is the source of light in all luminous objects. He is beyond the darkness of matter and is unmanifested. He is knowledge, he is the object of knowledge, and he is the goal of knowledge. He is situated in everyone's heart. So there we get a nice detailed description of the supersoul, one of the two objects of knowledge. The next section of the chapter we learn about Prakriti, or nature, Purusha, the enjoyer, and their combination, or their union. Krishna explains Prakriti, or nature, and Purusha, the enjoyer, or the individual soul, are both eternal. Nature produces all material causes and effects, or in other words, nature produces all material bodies, and the soul associates with nature in its three modes. Again, we'll hear more about those modes in the next chapter, in an attempt to enjoy their manifestations. That means the various combinations of forms and tastes and smells and sounds and touches in this world. Those are all produced by material nature, specifically its three modes. And thus the soul, in its attempt to enjoy nature, accrues karma, which manifests as a material body in the next life, and a certain amount of material happiness and distress. So in this way, Krishna explains, we cause our own happiness and distress as we change from body to body in higher or lower species of life according to our own self-generated karma. Srila Prabhupada explains in his purport here, the different manifestations of body and senses among the living entities are due to material nature. There are 8,400,000 different species of life, and these varieties are creations of the material nature. They arise from the different sensual pleasures of the living entity, who thus desires to live in this body or that. When he is put into different bodies, he enjoys different kinds of happiness and distress. His material happiness and distress are due to his body, and not to himself as he is. In his original state, there is no doubt of enjoyment. Therefore, that is his real state. Because of the desire to lord it over material nature, he is in the material world. In the spiritual world, there is no such thing. The spiritual world is pure. But in the material world, everyone is struggling hard to acquire different kinds of pleasures for the body. Can you see yourself doing that? Struggling hard to acquire different kinds of pleasures for the body. It might be more clear to state that this body is the effect of the senses. The senses are instruments for gratifying desire. Now, the sum total, body and instrument senses, is offered by material nature, and as will be clear in the next verse, the living entity is blessed or damned with circumstances according to his past desire and activity. According to one's desires and activities, material nature places one in various residential quarters. The being himself is the cause of his attaining such residential quarters and his attendant enjoyment or suffering. Once placed in some particular kind of body, he comes under the control of nature, because the body, being matter, acts according to the laws of nature. At that time, the living entity has no power to change that law. Suppose an entity is put into the body of a dog. As soon as he is put into the body of a dog, he must act like a dog. He cannot act otherwise, and if the living entity is put into the body of a hog, then he is forced to eat stool and act like a hog. Similarly, if the living entity is put into the body of a demigod, he must act according to his body. This is the law of nature. But in all circumstances, the Supersoul is with the individual soul. That is explained in the Vedas, Mundaka Upanishad, as follows: Va Suparna Sayuja Sakaya. The Supreme Lord is so kind upon the living entity that he always accompanies the individual soul, and in all circumstances is present as the Supersoul or Paramatma. So Krishna goes on to explain the position of the Supersoul, who is the real enjoyer. Krishna says, yet in this body there is another, a transcendental enjoyer, who is the Lord, the Supreme Proprietor, who exists as the overseer and permitter, and who is known as the Supersoul. So the Supersoul in the heart witnesses and permits the desires and activities of the individual soul, like a parent does with a small child. A small child wants to do something, but it can't do it independently, so the parent, witnessing the desire of the child, facilitates that desire. The soul desires something, the Supersoul sanctions it, and material nature carries it out, while the results of the action in terms of its success or failure, the amount of happiness and distress that actually comes from it, depend on the karma of that particular soul which it generated in the past. How does karma work? Who is taking note of everybody's desires and everybody's actions and administering all the reactions to those actions? Krishna is explaining here, he's doing it himself as the Supersoul in the heart of every living being. He's the witness and permitter of all desires and activities in the material world. The Supersoul is described here as the actual enjoyer. Why? Because everything belongs to him. Just as in the ordinary sense, that we are the legitimate enjoyers of what we own. Similarly, in the absolute sense, everything is Krishna's energy. Everything belongs to him. Therefore, he is the legitimate and supreme enjoyer of everything. Let's go on to the final key point for the chapter, which is the vision of a true seer. How does someone who actually has this knowledge explained in this chapter, knowledge of the soul, the Supersoul, and nature, see things? Krishna explains here, O chief of the Bhartas, know that whatever you see in existence, both the moving and the non-moving, is only a combination of the field of activities and the knower of the field. One who sees the Supersoul accompanying the individual soul in all bodies, and who understands that neither the soul nor the Supersoul within the destructible body is ever destroyed, actually sees. One who sees the Supersoul equally present everywhere, in every living being, does not degrade himself by his mind. Thus he approaches the transcendental destination. One who can see that all activities are performed by the body, which is created of material nature, and sees that the self does nothing, actually sees. When a sensible person ceases to see different identities due to different material bodies, and he sees how beings are expanded everywhere, he attains to the Brahman conception. That means the spiritual conception. Those with the vision of eternity can see that the imperishable soul is transcendental, eternal, and beyond the modes of nature. Despite contact with the material body, O Arjuna, the soul neither does anything nor is entangled. The sky, due to its subtle nature, does not mix with anything, although it is all-pervading. Similarly, the soul situated in Brahman vision, spiritual vision, does not mix with the body, those situated in that body. O son of Bharata, as the sun alone illuminates all this universe, so does the living entity, one within the body, illuminate the entire body by consciousness. Remember, this point was made at the beginning of the second chapter as well. Consciousness is the evidence or the proof of the soul, just as sunlight is the proof or the evidence of the sun. Those who see with eyes of knowledge the difference between the body, the knower of the body, and can also understand the process of liberation from bondage and material nature, attain to the supreme goal. Let's have a look at Srila Prabhupada's purport here for this final text in this final section of the chapter, in which we hear about the vision of a true seer. Srila Prabhupada says, the purport of this 13th chapter is that one should know the distinction between the body, the owner of the body, and the Supersoul. One should recognize the process of liberation as described in verses 8 through 12. Then one can go on to the supreme destination. A faithful person should at first have some good association to hear of God, and thus gradually become enlightened. If one accepts a spiritual master, one can learn to distinguish between matter and spirit, and that becomes the stepping stone for further spiritual realization. A spiritual master, by various instructions, teaches his students to get free from the material conception of life. For instance, in Bhagavad Gita, we find Krishna instructing Arjuna to free him from materialistic considerations. One can understand that this body is matter. It can be analyzed with its 24 elements. The body is the gross manifestation, and the subtle manifestation is the mind and psychological effects. And the symptoms of life are the interaction of these features. But over and above this, there is the soul, and there is also the Supersoul. The soul and the Supersoul are two. This material world is working by the conjunction of the soul and the 24 material elements. One who can see the constitution of the whole material manifestation as this combination of the soul and material elements, and can also see the situation of the Supreme Soul, becomes eligible for transfer to the spiritual world. These things are meant for contemplation and for realization, and one should have a complete understanding of this chapter with the help of the spiritual master. Let's summarize the chapter. We've heard Arjuna's 6 questions. What is Prakriti or nature, Purusha or the enjoyer, Chaitra, the field, Chaitragya, its knower, and knowledge, and the object of knowledge. Krishna answered by saying that Prakriti or nature is the cause of all material bodies, and Purusha, the enjoyer, is the illusion soul who wants to enjoy nature and therefore takes on one material body after another due to karma. Chaitra refers to the field of activities or the material body, and Chaitragya is its knower, the soul and the Supersoul, both of whom are transcendental to material nature, although the Supersoul is conscious of all bodies, while the individual soul is only conscious of its own body. Knowledge, jnana, means to understand the relationship between the soul, the Supersoul, and nature, while the knowable, jnayam, refers to what is to be known, the soul and the Supersoul. We've also heard about the process for acquiring knowledge, which begins with humility and ends in pure devotion to Krishna. I'd like to conclude this class by reading a section of one of Srila Prabhupada's purports from this chapter. He says, the fact is that every individual living entity is eternally part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, and both of them are very intimately related as friends. But the living entity has the tendency to reject the sanction of the Supreme Lord and act independently in an attempt to dominate nature. And because he has this tendency, he is called the marginal energy of the Supreme Lord. The living entity can be situated either in the material energy or in the spiritual energy. As long as he is conditioned by the material energy, the Supreme Lord, as his friend, the Supersoul, stays with him just to get him to return to the spiritual energy. The Lord is always eager to take him back to the spiritual energy. But due to his minute independence, the individual entity is continually rejecting the association of spiritual light. This misuse of independence is the cause of his material strife in the conditioned nature. The Lord, therefore, is always giving instruction from within and from without. From without, he gives instructions as stated in the Bhagavad Gita, and from within, he tries to convince the living entity that his activities in the material field are not conducive to real happiness. Just give it up and turn your faith toward me, then you will be happy, he says. Thus, the intelligent person who places his faith in the Paramatma, or the Supreme Personality of Godhead, begins to advance toward a blissful eternal life of knowledge. Let's preview Chapter 14. Chapter 14 is entitled The Three Modes of Material Nature. In this chapter, Krishna elaborates on what he said in Chapter 13, text 22, that the soul is entangled in material nature's cycle of repeated birth and death due to association with its three modes. In Chapter 14, he explains what those three modes of nature are, how they bind, and how they can give liberation. Thank you so much for joining me today in this class on Chapter 13, Nature, the Enjoyer, and Consciousness. And I look forward to seeing you in the next class on Chapter 14, the three modes of material nature.